Chapter 24. The Pavilion. At 9 o'clock, D'Artagnan was at the Hôtel de Gardes. He found Planchet under arms, and the fourth horse arrived. Planchet was armed with his carbine and pistol. D'Artagnan had provided himself with his sword and placed 2 pistols in his belt. They each bestrode a horse and went off quietly. It was a dark night, and none saw them depart. Planchet followed his master at the distance of 10 paces. D'Artagnan passed over the quays, went out by the gate of La Conference, and proceeded along the charming road, far more beautiful then than now, which leads to St. Cloud. As long as they continued in the town, Planchet kept the respectful distance that he had fixed for himself, but when the road became more lonely and obscure, he gradually drew nearer, so that when they entered the Bois de Boulogne, he found himself quite naturally riding side by side with his master. In fact, we must not deny that the waving of the trees and the reflection of the moon against the sombre copses caused him much uneasiness. D'Artagnan perceived that something extraordinary was incommoding his lackey. "Well, Planchet," demanded he, "what ails you now?" "Do you not find, sir, that woods are like churches?" "And why, Planchet?" "Because one is as much afraid of speaking loudly in the one as in the other." "Why dare you not speak loudly, Planchet? Because you're in fear?" "Yes, sir, in fear of being heard." "Fear of being heard! Our conversation is very proper, my dear Planchet, and no one would find anything in it to censure." "Ah, sir," replied Planchet, returning to the ruling idea in his mind, "that Monsieur Bonacieux has a sly gloom about the eyebrows, and something so unpleasant in the working of his lips." "What the plague makes you think so much of Monsieur Bonacieux?" "Sir, we think of what one must, and not of what one would." "Because you are a coward, Planchet." "Let us not confound prudence with cowardice, sir. Prudence is a virtue." "And you are very virtuous, are you not, Planchet?" "Is not that the barrel of a musket, sir, shining below there? Suppose we were to stoop our heads?" "Really," muttered D'Artagnan, who remembered the advice of Monsieur de Treville, "really, this animal will finish by making me afraid," and he put his horse at a trot. Planchet followed his master's movements precisely as if he had been his shadow, and soon found himself trotting by his side. "Must we travel in this manner all the night, sir?" demanded he. "No, Planchet, for you are at your journey's end." "What? I am at my journey's end, and you, sir?" "I shall go a little way farther." "And leave me here alone, sir?" "Are you afraid, Planchet?" "No, but I will merely observe to you, sir, that the night will be very cold, that cold causes rheumatism, and that a lackey who has the rheumatism makes but a sorry servant, especially to such an active master as yourself." "Well, then, if you are cold, you can enter one of those wine shops which you see down there, but you must be waiting for me before the door at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning." "But, sir, I have most dutifully eaten and drunk the crown that you gave me this morning, so that I have not got even a stray sou remaining, in case I should feel cold." "There's a half-pistole. Good-bye till tomorrow morning." D'Artagnan got off his horse, threw the bridle to Planchet, and hurried away, closely enveloped in his cloak. "Good God, how cold I am!" exclaimed Planchet as soon as he had lost sight of his master, and, eager as he was to warm himself, he hastened to rap at the door of a house which had all the appearance of a suburban dram-shop. In the meantime, D'Artagnan, who had taken a narrow crossroad, reached St. Cloud, but instead of proceeding along the main street, he turned behind the castle, went down a narrow, unfrequented lane, and soon found himself opposite the appointed pavilion. It was situated in a perfect desert of a place, a long wall, at the corner of which was a pavilion, run along one side of this lane, and on the other a hedge had from the wayfarer a small garden, at the bottom of which there stood a miserable cottage. He had now reached the place of appointment, and as he had not been told to announce his presence by any signal, he waited. Not a sound was heard. He might have fancied himself 100 leagues from the capital. D'Artagnan cast a glance behind him, and then leaned his back against the hedge. Beyond this hedge and garden and cottage, a heavy mist enveloped in its shade that vast immensity where Paris slept, an immensity void and open in which some luminous posts glittered like the funeral stars of that vast pandemonium of suffering and sin. But to D'Artagnan all aspects indicated beauteous forms, all images were wreathed in smiles, all darkness was transparent light. The appointed hour was on the eve of striking. In fact, at the end of a few minutes, the belfry of St. Cloud slowly emitted 10 strokes from its broad, sonorous jaws. There was something melancholy in that voice of bronze which thus breathed its lamentations in the night. But each of those sounds which told the hour he sighed for vibrated harmoniously in the heart of the young man. His eyes were fixed on the pavilion which stood at the corner of the wall, and of which all the windows were closed with shutters except one upon the first floor. From this window there shone a soft light which silvered over the trembling foliage of 2 or 3 linden trees, which formed a group outside the park. Doubtless, behind that little window which was so kindly lighted up, the pretty Madame Bonancieux awaited him. A lingering sentiment of diffidence restrained her, but now that the hour had struck, the window would be opened, and D'Artagnan would at last receive from the hands of love the meed of his devotion. Flattered by this sweet belief, D'Artagnan waited a half-hour without any impatience, keeping his eyes fixed upon that charming little abode, and distinguishing through the upper part of the window a part of those gilded cornices of the ceiling which gave evidence of the elegances of the remainder of the apartment. The belfry of St. Cloud proclaimed 10:30. But this time, without his knowing why, a shudder ran through the veins of D'Artagnan. Perhaps also the cold began to affect him, and he mistook for a moral impression what was in reality a sensation altogether physical. Then the idea occurred to him that he had mistaken the hour of the appointment, and that it must have been at 11 instead of 10. He approached the window, placed himself under the ray of light, drew the letter from his pocket, and read it again. He was not mistaken. The appointment was really for 10 o'clock. He resumed his post, becoming uneasy at the silence and solitude. It struck 11. D'Artagnan began to fear that something had really happened to Madame Bonancieux. He clapped his hands 3 times, the usual signal of lovers, but nothing, not even echo, returned an answer. And then he thought with some displeasure that the young woman had perhaps fallen asleep whilst waiting for him. He approached the wall and attempted to climb it, but the wall was newly rough cast, and he broke his nails to no purpose. At this moment he thought of the trees, of which the leaves were still silvered over by the light, and perceiving that one drooped over the road, he fancied that from amidst its branches he might be able to see into the pavilion. The tree was easy to climb. Besides, D'Artagnan was scarcely 20 years of age, and therefore well remembered his schoolboy habits. In an instant he was in the midst of its branches, and through the transparent windows his eyes plunged into the interior of the pavilion. Strange it was, and it made him shudder from the soles of his feet to the hair of his head, to find that the gentle flame, that quiet lamp, threw light upon a scene of frightful disarray. One of the panes of the window was demolished, the door of the room had been broken open and hung half-broken on its hinges. A table, which must have been covered with elegant supper, lay upon the ground, and glasses and fragments and crushed fruits were thickly spread upon the floor. Everything in that room indicated a violent and desperate struggle, and D'Artagnan believed that he could even detect amidst this strange medley some strips of clothes and some stains of blood congealed on the tablecloth and curtains. With his heart beating horribly, he hastily descended to the ground to examine if he could not find some further traces of violence. The small and gentle light still shone amidst the calmness of the night. D'Artagnan then perceived what had escaped him at first, when nothing prompted him to so close a scrutiny, that the ground was broken in one place and dug up in another, and was marked by confused impressions of the footsteps of both men and horses. The wheels of a carriage, which seemed to have come from Paris, had, moreover, left upon the soft soil a deep rut, which proceeded no further than the pavilion and returned again toward Paris. And, last of all, in pursuing his researches, he found near the wall a woman's torn glove. But this glove, wherever it had not come in contact with the mud, was irreproachably fresh. It was one of those perfumed gloves which the lover likes to pull from a pretty hand. As D'Artagnan pursued these investigations, at every fresh discovery a more abundant and more icy moisture stood upon his brow. His heart was wrung with fearful anguish, and his respiration almost failed. And yet, he said to encourage himself, perhaps this pavilion had nothing to do with Madame Bonancieux. Her appointment was before the pavilion, not within it. She had possibly been detained in Paris by her duties, or perhaps by her husband's jealousy. But all these reflections were beaten down, destroyed, and driven to flight by that internal sentiment of grief which, on some occasions, takes exclusive possession of our entire being and announces in an unmistakable language that some great suffering hovers over our heads. And then D'Artagnan became almost frantic. He ran upon the highway, hastened along the road he had come by, and advanced as far as the ferry-boat and questioned the ferryman. About 7 o'clock in the evening, the ferryman had ferried over a woman enveloped in a dark cloak, who seemed to be exceedingly anxious to escape recognition, but, precisely on account of her precautions, he had been the more observant, and had discovered that she was young and pretty. There were then, as now, crowds of young and pretty women who came to St. Cloud, and who had reasons for desiring to remain unseen, yet D'Artagnan doubted not for an instant that it was Madame Bonancieux whom the ferryman had brought across. D'Artagnan took advantage of the lamp in the ferryman's cottage to read the note of Madame Bonancieux once more and to assure himself that he had made no mistake, that the appointment was really at St. Cloud and not elsewhere, and before the pavilion of Monsieur d'Estrées and not in another street. Everything concurred to prove to D'Artagnan that his presentiments were not groundless, and that some great misfortune had actually occurred. He ran back to the castle, fancying that during his absence something new might have taken place at the pavilion, and that some fresh instructions might be awaiting him there. The lane was still deserted, and the same calm, soft light streamed from the window. D'Artagnan then remembered that dark and wretched cottage, which doubtless had seen and might perhaps also speak. The gate of the enclosure was shut, but he jumped over the hedge, and in spite of the barking of a chained dog, approached the cottage. At his first summons, no one answered. A death-like silence prevailed here as well as in the pavilion, yet as this cottage was his last resource, he persisted. Now he fancied he heard a slight noise within, a timid noise which seemed itself to be afraid of being heard. Then D'Artagnan ceased to knock and made entreaties in such a piteous accent of fear, mingled with flattery, that his voice would have reassured the most timorous. At length an old worm-eaten shutter was opened, or rather half-opened, and instantly shut again as soon as the light of a miserable lamp, which was burning in a corner, had disclosed the belt, the hilt of the sword, and the pistols of D'Artagnan. And yet, quick as had been the movement, had he been able to see the head of an old man. "In the name of heaven," said he, "listen to me. I expected someone who has not come. I'm dying from anxiety. Has any misfortune happened in your neighborhood? Speak." The window was again slowly opened, and the same countenance reappeared, only it was paler than before. D'Artagnan told his story simply, merely withholding names. He stated that he had an appointment with a young woman before this pavilion, and that, not seeing her come, he had climbed the linden tree and had, by light of the lamp, perceived the disorder of the room. The old man listened attentively with many signs of assent, and when D'Artagnan had ended, shook his head in a manner which was not encouraging. "What do you mean?" exclaimed D'Artagnan. "In the name of heaven, explain yourself." "Oh, sir," said he, "do not ask me anything, for if I should tell you what I have seen, most assuredly no good will befall me." "You have seen something, then?" exclaimed D'Artagnan. "In that case, in heaven's name," continued he, throwing him a pistol, "tell me what you have seen, and on the honor of a gentleman, not one of your words shall pass my lips." The old man read so much honesty and grief in D'Artagnan's countenance that he made him a sign to listen and said in a low voice, "It was about 9 o'clock that I heard some noise in the street, and wishing to know what it was, I was going to my gate when I saw some people trying to get in. As I am poor and have no fear of being robbed, I went to open it, and saw 3 men a few paces from me. In the shade was a carriage with horses harnessed to it, and also some led horses. These led horses evidently belonged to the 3 men who were dressed for riding. 'Ah, my good sirs,' I cried, 'what do you want?' 'You ought to have a ladder,' said one who appeared to be the leader of the party. 'Yes, sir, that with which I gather my fruit.' 'Give it to us, and go back into your house, and here's a crown for the trouble we give you. But remember, if you say one word about what you see or hear, for however we may threaten you, I'm sure that you will both hear and see all that we do, you're a lost man.' At these words he threw me a crown which I picked up, and he took my ladder. In fact, having fastened the gate and the hedge after them, I pretended to enter my house, but I went out again by the back door, and gliding in the shade, I came to those alder bushes, from the shelter of which I could see everything without being seen myself. The 3 men had brought up the carriage without any noise. They pulled out of it a fat, short, grey little man, shabbily dressed in a sad-coloured doublet, who carefully mounted the ladder, looked sulkily at the window, came down with a wolf's steps, and muttered in a low voice, 'It is she.' He who had spoken to me immediately went to the door of the pavilion, which he opened with the key which he had about him, and then shut the door after him and disappeared. The other 2 men mounted the ladder simultaneously. The little old man remained at the carriage door, the coachman took care of his horses, and a lackey of the led ones. Suddenly, great outcries resounded from the pavilion, and a woman ran to the window and opened it as if to throw herself out. But as soon as she saw the 2 men, she threw herself back, and the 2 men rushed into the chamber after her. Then I saw nothing more, but I heard the noise of breaking furniture. The woman screamed and cried for help, but her cries were soon stifled. The 3 men returned to the window, carrying the woman in their arms, and 2 of them came down the ladder, and bore her to the carriage, into which the little old man entered with her. He who had remained in the pavilion shut the window, came out at the door directly after, and satisfied himself that the woman was in the carriage. His 2 companions were already on their horses, waiting for him. He sprang into his saddle, and the groom took his place beside the coachman. The carriage, escorted by the 3 horsemen, departed at a gallop, and all was over. From that moment until your arrival, I've neither seen nor heard anything." D'Artagnan, overwhelmed by these terrible tidings, remained motionless and speechless whilst the demons of jealousy and anger raged in his heart. "But, my gentlemen," said the old man, on whom this mute despair had more effect than cries and tears would have produced, "do not despond. They've not killed her. That is the great thing." "Do you know at all," said D'Artagnan, "who is the man who conducted this infernal expedition?" "I do not know him." "But as he spoke to you, you could see him?" "Ah, it is his appearance that you want to know." "Yes. A tall, lean, brown man with black mustaches, a dark eye, and the look of a gentleman." "That's it!" cried D'Artagnan. "Him again! The same man, always the same. It's my evil genius, apparently. And the other?" "Which? The little one?" "Oh, he was not a gentleman, I answer for it. Besides, he did not carry a sword, and the others treated him with no sort of respect." "Some servant," muttered D'Artagnan. "Ah, poor woman, what have they done with her?" "You promised me to be secret," said the old man. "And I renew my promise. Be satisfied. I'm a gentleman. A gentleman has only his word, and I've given you mine." D'Artagnan returned toward the ferry, almost heartbroken. Sometimes he could not believe that it was Madame Bonancieux, and hoped to find her the next day at the Louvre. Sometimes he fancied that she had an intrigue with another, and had been discovered and carried off by some third party who was jealous of him. He doubted, sorrowed, and despaired. "Oh," cried he, "if I had but my friends here, should at any rate have some hopes of finding her, but who knows what has become of them also?" It was then nearly midnight, and he must at once find Planchet. D'Artagnan searched successively every wine shop where he perceived a little light, but nowhere could he find his servant. At length, after examining half a dozen, he began to reflect that the search was rather fortuitous. He had himself said 6 o'clock in the morning, therefore wherever Planchet was, he was fully justified. Besides, it occurred to the young man that, by remaining in the neighborhood of the place where this event had happened, he might gather some information. At the 6th wine shop, as we have said, he therefore remained, and asking for a bottle of their best wine, placed himself in the darkest corner, and was determined there to await the return of day. But this time, too, his hope was disappointed, and although he opened his ears to every sound, he heard nothing, amidst the oaths and gestures and abuse which were exchanged by the workmen, lackeys, and cab-drivers, who composed the honorable society of which he was a part, that could put him all upon the track of the poor ill-used woman. He was obliged, therefore, after having emptied his bottle, and in order that he might avoid remark, to occupy himself in seeking for the easiest posture in which to sleep as best he could. It must be remembered that D'Artagnan was not 20 years old, and at that age sleep has undeniable rights which must be submitted to even by the most desolate hearts. About 6 o'clock in the morning, D'Artagnan awoke with that feeling of discomfort which generally comes with the break of day after an uneasy night. His toilet did not occupy him long, and having searched himself to see that no one had taken advantage of his sleep to rob him, and found his diamond on his finger, his purse in his pocket, and his pistols in his belt, he paid for his wine and sallied forth to try whether he should be more fortunate in seeking for his servant in the morning than at night. And the first thing that he perceived through the damp grey fog was honest Planchet, who, with the 2 horses, was waiting for him at the door of a miserable little wine shop, before which D'Artagnan had passed without even suspecting its existence.